Hello and good afternoon. In this short video presentation, I will provide a description of the California Environmental Quality Act. This description will include the main purpose of the CEQA and the typical proceedings of an environmental project. In order to give a full description, I will give background about the National Environmental Policy Act, or the NEPA, since the law inspired the creation of the CEQA. First off, the beginning of the CEQA. The California Environmental Quality Act was signed in 1970 by California Governor Ronald Reagan. This law became the preliminary environmental law for the state of California. The NEPA paved the way for the CEQA. As I continue through the presentation, it will become apparent that there are many similarities. The NEPA instructs federal agencies to take their projects through the formal approval process. The intent of the process is to ensure that the project will cause the least amount of damage on the environment. In the case that the project will affect the environment, alternatives are pitched throughout the approval process. Unlike the CEQA, the NEPA has a council created by the U.S. Congress called the Council of Environmental Quality. This council is in charge of making sure that the NEPA is used correctly. Since I'm presenting on the CEQA, I will not spend too much time explaining the NEPA. However, I wanted to point out the three main checkpoints as a part of the process. First is to see if the project is not categorically excluded. This point in the procedure is indicated by the 1 located on the figure. If not, the project will proceed to the next phase. This is known as the environmental assessment. Look for the highlighted 2 on the figure. The environmental assessment is a description of why the project should be completed, describes alternative options for the given project and any impacts on the environment. Next, if the project proves to have substantial environmental impact, this is called finding of no significant impacts, indicated by the highlighted 3 on the figure. However, if the project does demonstrate the potential for environmental impact, then an environmental impact statement must be filed. This is located on the second figure, indicated by the number 4. Throughout this process, there are 3 distinct times that the public can comment on the given project. These sections are highlighted in yellow on both figures 1 and 2. Now for the purpose of the CEQA. The decision to sign the CEQA into law was supported by many valuable purposes. One of the main functions of the CEQA was to diminish the potential environmental impact of a project. In the case of possible harm, alternatives are introduced. If changes are not set in place to reduce the amount of damage to the environment, then the project will not be approved. The review of projects aims to produce well-informed decisions for government officials, since they have the whole picture in front of them. Detailed descriptions of projects are essential because without all the necessary information, the lead agencies cannot make accurate decisions. The CEQA also requires the disclosure of information to the public during the review process. This means the public is informed about potential projects in their immediate area and can comment on proceedings. Next, it's important to understand the CEQA guidelines and what projects they apply to. CEQA guidelines apply to projects in the state of California and agencies that are regional or local. Even projects that are approved and funded by the government must follow the CEQA guidelines. However, the federal agencies do not adhere to the CEQA guidelines. Instead, they must follow the NEPA guidelines, as I stated before. Next, it's important to understand what a project can be defined as. From the CEQA guidelines, a project is defined by the whole of an action which has a potential for resulting in either direct or physical change in the environment, or a reasonable foreseeable indirect change in the environment. CEQA guidelines from section 1537(8). This definition is stating that in order for an idea to become a project in CEQA terms, it must have direct or indirect effects on the immediate environment. Now that we understand the purpose of the CEQA, which projects must follow the guidelines, and what is a CEQA project, we are now going to see the approval process. As you can see, it is a lengthy process. There are many checkpoints that a project must go through in order to prove that it will have minimal impact on the environment. Before the CEQA guidelines are introduced, a public agency must decide if the proposed idea is a project. If not, the CEQA guidelines will not apply. Next is to see if the project is exempt. This means that the project will not have any significant effect on the environment. At that point, an exemption is filed. After this checkpoint, more agencies are added to the approval process. As depicted on the flowchart, the lead agency is an important group. The lead agency, as defined by CEQA, is a public agency that is responsible for approving the project and determining if an environmental impact report or negative declaration is necessary. Only one lead agency is allowed per project. Before deciding between an EIR or an ND, the lead agency starts an initial study. The initial study is a short excerpt about the project and possible environmental impacts. Now the lead agency decides between an EIR and an ND. The negative declaration is filed when the project does not demonstrate any significant impacts on the environment. It is also important to note that a notice of intent is necessary for the negative declaration. If the project does not fit the description of an EIR, then an EIR is filed. Because the report has significant potential for causing negative impact on the environment. The EIR also needs a notice of preparation similar to the negative declaration. Both environmental impact reports and negative declarations have a public review period duration of time where the public can comment on the report and the project. Another important agency is the responsible agency. These agencies are defined as public agencies that have optional power to approve a project. The responsible agency is consulted during the review process. If you take a look at the figure, there are 3 places where the responsible agency is in a consultation period with the lead agency. The responsible agency is important because they are in charge of resources that could be impacted by the project. So they are needed to be in constant contact with the lead agency and review the initial study, the environmental impact report or negative declaration, and so on. Next, what environmental impacts are lead agencies considering? Since the lead agency is responsible for approving a project, it is up to this lead agency to understand all the potential environmental impacts that this project can inflict on the surrounding area. The CEQA guidelines have included a checklist for the environment in Appendix G. Along with Appendix G, there are 5 environmental categories to consider. There's greenhouse gas, energy impact, impact of projects in dangerous locations, impacts from growth, and permanent environmental impacts. Recently, there have been updates for the CEQA guidelines. The Office of Planning and Research compiled the proposed updates and sent them to the Natural Resources Agency in November of 2017. There were roughly 30 sections updated during the process. Since there is such a large quantity of changes, I will highlight a few of these updates. One of the necessary alterations in the guidelines is about the exemption. The update changes the wording of the description for a project exemption. Instead of using general rule, the National Resources Agency replaced the wording with common sense exception. This might not seem significant, however, this change is necessary to eliminate any confusion. This clarification will create a more easily understood guideline for public agencies and the public in general. Another update to the project description: it is now necessary that the environmental impact report is written in a way that is significant to the public and agencies that make the decision for the project. Similar to other updates explained before, the clarification on the guidelines will encourage a concise and comprehensible guide. Some of the overall benefits from the updates include further analysis regarding the impact of transportation, greenhouse gas emission, adding more housing and job opportunities in urban areas. Additionally, updates to the guidelines have promoted a more seamless CEQA process, which in turn saves money and time because of the consents updates. Due to these clarifications in CEQA guidelines, they are anticipated to increase in sustainability decisions that relate to water, energy, and greenhouse gas emissions. And as you can see on the slide, it says the last changes to the guidelines occurred in the late 1990s. Finally, as one can imagine, the California Environmental Quality Act is a very important law. The law aims to protect the natural environment and conserve any resources. The implementation of public review allows the general population to stay involved with any decisions being made within their community. This law promotes public safety and combats any environmental injustices. Here are some of the sources I used to gain more information on the topic. Thank you for listening to my presentation on the California Environmental Quality Act.